The reason why I wanted to speak to you last year and now this year, and I'm glad for this opportunity, was to talk to you about a panorama, a public biography of a servant, with the intent to look at what are the influences either for political, economic, serving the citizens of the country, what are the influences that it helps to build that panorama. Now, you are in South Africa and globally considered as a servant of the people. What does that mean? What do you understand by that?
Well, we take that from what Madiba said, that I think I can't quote his exact words, but he said, I stand before you as a servant of the people. In other words, if you interpret that, is that he was trying to say, and which I would echo, is we are there to serve the people, primarily. Not to tell the people what they should be doing, but to listen to the people as servants of the people. So we take that cue from Madiba.
Okay. Do you have a sense as to what does it mean to be a servant?
Well, at all times we must be conscious of the fact that once you're in public life like ours, you are no longer an individual. You are answerable to people. That's your primary concern all the time. You're no longer an individual just taking any individual decisions. You are always conscious of the fact that you are in this position as a servant of the people. Naturally, you work through smaller units like committees and so forth.
Right.
But at all times, that is the primary concern.
So, if we look at that, and you're saying that you listen to the people, then tell the people about who is this people that you're referring to?
Well, in an organized form, when we talk of the people, is the people who are represented by the organizations. Because we can't take a general view that we're talking about the people, but they are also in an organized way.
Mm-hmm.
So in my case, it will be the African National Congress. Although the ANC only opened up its membership much later to everybody, but before that also we worked in an alliance, so for all intents and purposes we were ANC. Congress alliance, but at the head of which was the ANC.
I notice that traveling from the airport to the foundation, and I traveled through Soweto, Kliptown, and then eventually I got to Lenasia. Something struck me that many of the foundations that serves people in a philanthropic way are located in the metros, in the big cities, in the business centers. Why is it that your foundation is established here and not in one of the big business centers?
You know, it may be, now I can't be definite, it may have been that originally when I came out of prison, I came to Lenasia. I stayed here in Lenasia for a good few years. It may be because of that. And then, of course, our office is situated here. Again, for historic reasons. The activists who eventually formed the foundation, were based here. And I thought this was the best. But at the moment there's some thinking going on about relocating to Constitution here.
Right.
But that is still in the thinking.
But when you were young, before you got detained and in prison, there were certain characteristics, certain strengths that carried you through. Could you share that? Those strengths. What was it that carried you to those difficult, brutal periods of apartheid?
Well, you know, in my case, I got swept into politics at a very young age, when you haven't got any independent thinking. For instance, I got into the Young Communist League at the age of 12, where there is very little independent thinking. It so happens I'm staying in Fordsburg, and in Fordsburg there's a sort of a club run by the Young Communist League. So as young people, we were attracted to the activities, lectures, picnics, film shows and so forth. But what first attracted me to politics as a youngster is the arrival in the country of Dr. Dadu, after he returned from Edinburgh as a doctor, but he immediately got into politics. And my first memory of taking an active interest is when he goes to jail in 1940 for opposing the war. So I'm 1940, I'm 11, 12 years old.
Right.
Yeah. But the fact that he's already, at that time, I'm talking of blacks in general. You could only think of Dr. Kuma, Dr. Dadu, and maybe one other black doctors in general.
Mm-hmm.
So the very fact that they were doctors, they already stand out as leaders. You don't even think of them as politicians.
Right.
They are doctors. And as doctors, you look up to them. So what I'm saying is that as youngsters, you don't think politically. You think of this man who's a doctor or a university student. And you already get impressed. But then you see some of the activities. Here's a man who's going to jail in 1940. Again, as youngsters, when he went to jail for opposing the war, that is before the Soviet Union came into the war, he was the first political prisoner in South Africa after a very, very long time. So again, that in itself is something that here's somebody, a doctor, who's in jail. Just a few months, but you get impressed by that fact. Because you've got already, as children, you've already heard of the struggle in India.
Right.
You've heard of Gandhi, you've heard of Nehru, you've heard of Gandhi in South Africa when he was here. But more contemporary, you hear of the struggle in India, of the All India Congress. And naturally, you live in an environment where there are organizations here which also are closely allied to the Indian struggle. I'm not talking of the Congress organizations, I'm talking of other organizations. So you follow the Indian struggle very closely too, because it was one of the last colonies of the British. Apart from some of the African countries.
What was the pull factor at the time for a youngster like yourself and others to look at well-educated people, medical doctors, and the future of practicing medicine was in front of them, but they preferred to serve, to be drawn into the politics. At a human level, what was one of those pulling factors?
Well, I mean, I can't answer for them. What I do know that a person like Dr. Dadu already got involved in politics when he was still abroad.
Right.
Got in touch with the movements in England and other countries, was influenced by them. So to some extent he was already in contact with political movements before he came back to South Africa. So when he came back, there was the Indian Congress, which was under the leadership of very conservative people.
Right.
Because after Gandhi left South Africa, the Indian Congress in South Africa fell under the leadership of business people, and concentrating not only on on business but on Indian business. So it was a very narrow organization. Dr. Dadu forms what is called a nationalist group of the Indian Congress. And the platform was much broader. Platform was unity of all the oppressed people, and the platform of passive resistance.
Right.
It's on that he was first member of the Non-European United Front, and then of the Indian Congress, but of the nationalist group of the Indian Congress, because the Indian Congress was still in the hands of business people. It was only in the 40s, through mass elections and so forth, that the leadership was changed from the very conservative leadership into the leadership of, as I say, the platform of oppressed people of South Africa, right, and not just a narrow Indian organization.
The influences of business at the time, and also the need to make sure that there's an openness around how that group of Indian people practice business principles. Did that have an influence on your life?
Not as business people. I mean, I come from a family of little retail shopping, but that didn't play any part except it became relevant politically. When India imposed sanctions against South Africa as a result of the call of the new leadership of the South African Indian Congress, which called upon India to break ties with South Africa, withdraw its High Commissioner, impose sanctions, and raise the matter of the United Nations. Right. That was in 46 already. So we took into account what was happening in India as well, because India took up, as a result of the changed leadership in the South African Indian Congress, the South African Indian Congress leadership under Dr. Dadu, Dr. Naika, came into leadership of the South African Indian Congress on the platforms of the unity of the oppressed people, sanctions, appealing to India to impose sanctions, and appealing to India to raise the whole matter at United Nations,
right,
which India did. Right. Broke sanctions, broke diplomatic relations with South Africa, recalled its High Commissioner, imposed sanctions. Sanctions worked very hard, very much, because at that time, maize is packed in the jute bags. And India was the only country that supplied jute. So as a youngster, I remember in places like Swaziland, shortage of jute for bags, heaps of maize.
That was in the Free State.
No, it's near the Free State.
Near the Free State.
It's northwest Transvaal. Yeah. It's
on the borders, close to the border.
Yeah, close to the border. So we saw heaps of maize because India has now imposed sanctions as a result of the call of the South African Indian Congress. But as I said, the leadership of the South African Indian Congress, which changed 1945-46 from the narrow outlook of Indians only to unity of the oppressed people and passive resistance. So the first thing that happened after that is 1947, there was a Doctors' Pact. Dr. Krumah, President of the African National Congress, Dr. Dadu, President of the Transvaal Indian Congress, Dr. Naika, President of the Natal Indian Congress. We couldn't talk yet of the South African Indian Congress because as a national body it was still in the hands of the older leadership. That was changed after that. So here we're talking of the two provincial congresses, where the majority of the Indians were, of course.
To be considered as a servant of the people, is it a calling?
I don't know. As I say, I got into politics as a youngster without much thinking.
Right.
But you come in as an individual, but you're always taking instructions. You're following decisions that are taken by the leadership. From childhood you learn that. You're not taking individual decisions.
Why is the collective in serving the people so important to you and the generation of leaders in your time? And over time it also happened while you were in prison. There was the view that to serve is there's a collective that must serve. Why was that so important?
Well, that was a departure from the old leadership of the Indian Congress, the ANC as well. It was decisions not at mass level until leaderships change. First of all, the leaderships changed in the Indian Congress and in 1950 in the ANC. When there was now the new approach of being really mass organizations, no longer organizations that meet every now and then, annually or sometimes after many years, at little conferences and so forth. Both the Indian Congress and the African Congress changed into mass organizations, no longer just at leadership level taking decisions, conferences, branches, and so forth, so that the whole question of collectivism comes in.
So you say you were drawn into being to the service of the people through politics, but surely the policies at that time had much more. There was a greater sense of impediments to be part of politics than to voluntarily get involved in politics. What happened at the level of you as a young person in school, beyond school, that actually drew you into wanting to serve?
Well, as I said, that I got involved in the Young Communist League in 1942. And then later on in the Indian Youth Congress, and then when the Congress leadership of the Indian Congress itself changed into more progressive leadership, into Indian Congress activities. So gradually I matured with the progress of the organizations. But in 1946, when I was in my matric year, the Indian Congress in South Africa started a passive resistance campaign for the first time after Gandhi left. A passive resistance campaign against a law that applied only against the Indians. Land and licensing. And as I said, I was in my matric year when this started.
Right.
So without finishing matric, I followed the example of two individuals who were closer to me than Dr. Dadu. Dr. Dadu was the big figure somewhere.
Right.
But the more immediate were two students, or four students, two law students, Ismail Mir, J.N. Singh, medical students, Dr. Patel, Dr. Aswat, his wife. These were medical students and law students. And just to add one thing, with knowing these law students like Ismail Mir and J.N. Singh, he occupied a place in Market Street, a flat. And after law lectures one day, he comes into the flat with Madiba. 1946. This is the first time I would meet Madiba. He's a law student, but he's a law student together with Ismail Mir. And that's where I meet them. So my attitude really has broadened with the Young Communist League. You know, working with wider sections of the oppressed people and progressive voices as well. So I didn't have to learn all that again. That became the fundamental groundwork for me already. So it was not new to me.
So if you look back from the time before the Rivonia trial, and also the time that you spend with the late President Mandela, late Cohen Mbeki and others, and you look at today and use all those years of experience, those decades of experience, how would you characterize a servant?
As a servant?
A servant of the people.
That remains, no matter what position one occupies in politics. You're always conscious of the fact that you may be an individual in private life, but in public life you're a servant of the people. In other words, even in a little foundation like this, which is not a political organization, but it also depends on a wider grouping.
Right.
You know. So your individuality is submerged in a wider society of people. Now, when I gave up my studies in matric, I took the example of these two law students and two medical students. When they gave up, me in matric thought, well, if these people have given up, why not me? So I also gave up, without writing matric, gave up full time into the office of the Indian Congress and the passive resistance movement. And in December of 46, when this passive resistance started in June of 46, in December I went to prison for the first time. And in this batch of prison, going to prison, I was with a teacher of mine from Standard 3. So this passive resistance movement, I went to jail for the first time at the age of 17, occupying a piece of land in Durban, which was for whites only. And the Indian Congress had decided to call upon volunteers to occupy that land and go to jail. So I went to, with my group, occupy that piece of land in Durban and went to prison for a month, 1946.
And all of those experiences and activities that during the harsh period of brutal apartheid, violent and brutal apartheid, was to work and contribute to the liberation of the people of the country.
Absolutely, yeah.
On the other hand, on the other side of the railway line, if you can put it that way, on the other side of the street, were youngsters, probably the same age as you and younger, that were fighting and supporting the apartheid regime. They were servants of the apartheid system. With the police, the security forces, and those that were part of at the time running the government. How would you characterize those type of servants?
Well, our contact with white and black police were the security police.
Mm-hmm.
There was no difference. They were police.
Right.
Yeah. And we treated them all as police, as enemies. So that when we were at meetings and chased out the police, it was black and white police.
Right.
But in fairness, there were black police, individuals.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't personally have contact with them, but people like Madiba and Walter Sissoul and them had. So they became useful in passing information. But I must repeat, I was too young to be having contact with them, but Madiba and them had this useful contact with the black police in the security establishment.
Why do you think, at the time, if you can think back and also now what a rich hindsight that you have, why would servants at that time, whether they were white or black, serve in the apartheid oppressive regime? What was the pulling factor? For you it was pulling to liberate, to serve and to liberate people, and politics is an important spur to it, was an important facility to be able to serve. In this instance, it was to oppress. What type of character at the time would have served an apartheid regime? If you look at it with hindsight.
Well, you know, for instance, if we go fast forward to the Bantustans,
Mm-hmm.
by that time you're a bit more mature. And the Bantustans made apartheid possible, their cooperation with the. So by that time, of course, the organizations themselves worked very strongly against Bantustans because they were servants of apartheid. Really.
Mm-hmm.
And if they had taken a strong stand, the apartheid would have been very difficult to. But once they started accepting Bantustans and becoming so-called puppet presidents and so forth, they cooperated in the implementation of apartheid.
Yeah.
Similarly, in the Indian community, we had this House of Delegates. Coloureds, you had the House of Representatives. They were all puppets of the apartheid regime, carrying out apartheid policies, pretending to be working for the oppressed people. In their outlook, they claimed that, but in fact, they were making apartheid workable. So we had these among the oppressed people. Mm-hmm. But fortunately, they were a minority.
During the time that you were in prison, and when you were released from prison, and then eventually when late President Madiba came out of prison, did you notice any change in the behavior of the civil servants at the time towards you and the others, in attitude, in mannerism, in the way they related to you as a group?
Well, you know, the personal example there would be the white civil servants we came across in 94.
Mm-hmm.
Apart from that, you meet the white and black civil servants when you have to meet with them for anything that you want to. If you want to, like for instance, Indians were not allowed to travel from one province to another without a permit. So you go to the office, there's white civil servants and black civil servants. So in that capacity you meet them. And later on, of course, when things changed, 94, when I'm in the president's office,
Mm-hmm.
now we came across white civil servants, because the whole leadership of the civil service was white, the senior leadership. We who were deprived, we didn't know what parliament was.
Mm-hmm.
Who do we turn to? We go into parliament 94, we don't know what a parliament is. We have, and in every ministry, we didn't know how to run government. We didn't know how to run water affairs or electricity or anything. The black civil servants were at a lower level, even in the civil service. You had to rely on the white civil servants. So you take the 5 years of the interim government. If the white civil servants wanted to sabotage, they could have done a lot of damage.
Right.
The police, the army, the civil service, they could have done a lot of damage. But by and large, they accepted that we have a new boss. And we cooperated.
What would you ascribe that sudden change of heart of a white civil servant?
Well, as you know, the transition was a negotiated transition. So that President de Klerk and his group, they worked together in the transition. The younger people today don't realize that part of history. Because it was a negotiated settlement. It's not as if MK came with guns and took over. It was a negotiated settlement with your President de Klerk and that party and so forth, which arrived at this settlement.
Sorry, you wanted to say?
No.
So what we managed to do is to look at the apartheid public servant.
Yeah.
Which was in orientation a very racist public servant, but also one that has been crafted in a way into Bantustan public servant, and also then the three houses of parliament at the time. And then we moved through the transitional stage where you were saying that the white senior public servants were in charge and there was lots of reliance on them, and they also always realized that there's a transitional government in place. Past that transition, we now effectively have a new constitutional democratic servant, both at the political level and at the administrative level. If you look at it, what is the expectation of that public servant?
Well, the expectation of any public servant is a servant of the people, but immediately is the servant of his immediate superiors in whatever department of government they are. But they have to inculcate in their minds that in whatever capacity they are civil servants. In other words, their responsibility are the people. That's what they have. That has to be inculcated in their minds.
So what criteria would you say needs a civil servant, does a servant need to comply with?
No,
Before he can be recognized as a servant.
Well, by and large, I mean, the civil servants have recognized. You find you still find people who are in an old mood, but by and large they have recognized that they are civil servants serving the people. And I think that transition is not complete. We still have problems every now and then, but by and large I think we've gone quite a long way in the civil servants accepting that there is a new government and they are now still servants of the people under a different government.
You're suggesting that the transition is not complete?
Oh, I don't think so. You know, we're only 20 years old as a democracy. We are still learning. As a country, we haven't got enough engineers. We can't run mines. We can't run factories. We still have to rely on the whites. As you know, engineering and all these avenues were closed. So you can't suddenly start producing engineers and experts in the various fields. Even now we have to rely on whites. Can we run a power station? Fortunately, we are getting people there. But we still can't do without the expertise. We can't. We still can't, we haven't reached a stage where we can run all industries. We are going there, we are getting there gradually. But precisely because our universities were not open for engineering and these expertise, it's a more recent thing. And even now, I don't know what the position is, whether every university provides degrees in the various fields. I'm not sure. But I won't be at all surprised if we still have to rely quite a bit on white expertise while our people are getting trained.
If you're suggesting that politicians, earlier you were saying that if you get drawn into politics, and because of that you inevitably become a politician operating in a political space. Do you think that today's politicians, across the board, across the political party divide, inside and outside the formal system of parliamentary politics, can today's politicians be considered as public servants?
Well, I think that is a whole learning experience. As elections come, new people come into parliament and councils and so forth. So it's a relatively learning experience for us who have been deprived of these things. Within one generation we can't learn everything. But I think that generalizing, I mean, I can't speak authoritatively. I think that our people are learning quite fast, and it's so good to see people in various positions who were previously deprived taking positions in various fields.
Do you think that politicians that are in the service of the public understand what it means to be in the service of the public?
Well, I can only see by the elections. Not the general elections of the country, but mainly the elections of the political organizations. I think the people are electing the leadership that they feel comfortable with, that they feel they can give over their future to people. I think that by and large our people are getting more and more mature, even in that field. I belonging to Gauteng, and I'm not active, but I do attend even regional conferences and so forth. And I see the growing interaction between leadership and people, which is so important. I'm very highly impressed with the Gauteng leadership that is there. I mean, I can't talk of others because I'm living here,
Right.
and I happen to know some of these leaders personally, and I think that I feel comfortable of the Gauteng leadership that I personally am under, and know personally. I feel comfortably that the people have elected the right people.
What is your take on South Africa today and public accountability?
Well, again, we are bound by the Constitution. And today we have got institutions, the highest institutions, where if there's any violation of the Constitution, the people have got recourse to various institutions until the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the country. That's the public protector and all that. So we have got these institutions that can be used, and people are using them.
Do you believe that there should be consequence for non-performance?
Provision is there. In the law there is provision, and hopefully that will happen when the need arises. I mean, government has been taken to court over and over again, and government at all levels have respected the courts.
Right. And there should be consequences for politicians and for civil servants.
For all of us, yes. We are under a constitutional democracy where people are bound by the Constitution and all these provisions.
Given what you said, it's only 20 years, just slightly over 20 years that since the new constitutional democracy. Many citizens across the country will say that we can't wait for another 20 years to be provided services based on the promises made by a political party. What would be your response to that?
No, I say, look, I'm not surprised at that expectation. When we said freedom, people will say, where's my house? The next day, where's this, where's my school, where's this? Those are expectations. But then you look at countries who got their independence long before us. Take our neighboring countries, they had independence long before us. Take India and these countries in the East. 20 years may be a long time in the life of an individual. In the life of a nation, it's not a long time. It's difficult to explain to the man in the street these things, because the ordinary people, and we shouldn't be surprised. They said, now you talk of freedom, where's our this thing, where's our children, why is the Hungary, why isn't there hospitalization? Can't surprise, I mean, that's expectations are there. I mean, the ordinary person doesn't read newspapers and follow the examples of other countries that got their independence long before us. I went to India lately. India got independence in 46, 47. They still got massive problems.
Right.
Similarly, I mean, our neighboring countries who got their independence long before us, there are massive problems. So you can't build a country, a whole nation within a short space of time.
Should the Constitution be responsive to the citizens?
Absolutely. All institutions of government eventually are responsible to the people of the country. That should be borne in mind by all people who are given the task of carrying out their constitutional duties. They must bear in mind that in the end they are servants of the people.
Are we as South Africans, and in particular, given the economic structure that we have, and the structural problems within it, but also the depth of poverty and inequality, In fact, we have many levels of stubborn poverty in the country. Is it a consequence of not having a economic codesa?
I don't know. I think it would be desirable. And I'm not an economist, I know very little about it, but I see there are calls for an economic codesa, and people who know would know much better than I do. I mean, I generally follow politics through my branch and the newspapers, but I can't speak authoritatively on that. Perhaps the time may have come for an economic codesa. I don't know. But there are people who are, directly involved in this know much better.
But if you look at the fact that codesa in itself was more towards the political orientation of the state, legislation, break down the rules, the procedures, the system in itself, that it probably there should have been a follow-up in terms of economic codesa that looks at the economy, because the economy is an important utility within any country.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just know the broad outlines of economics, but I can see calls being made increasingly for an economic codesa. I see that calls are being made. And there again, I leave it to people who are much better informed than I am in that.
Sure.
Unfortunately, all my life I've just been involved in politics and not anything more than that.
Right. I wanted to ask you this one, which links to my earlier question about public accountability. But the first part to that, what would you say you understand by political deployment? Because it seems to be different. It's one of those tools that different parties use across the political spectrum, whether it's in the States or in Europe, in South Africa, both parties that's currently running different governments, the DA in the Western Cape running the Western Cape, the ANC at the national, provincial, running provinces and national. And there seems to be quite a discontent around political deployment. What would your take be about what political deployment is actually, and what should it have been, and how it has changed over time?
No, I couldn't speak authoritatively on that, really. I'm not that much involved or informed about that to make a definitive statement on that.
But you were deployed, weren't you?
I was deployed to the President's office for the 5 years, and thereafter, just an ordinary member. I myself stood down from the National Executive in 1997, voluntarily. I stood down from Parliament after my first 5 years, so I stood down voluntarily from that.
The whole question, and this is now coming to the end of our conversation, is that the role of the elders in South Africa there's been calls for the elders to step up, if you like, onto the plate and say, this is not what we struggled for, and we need you to give some guidance to the leadership at different levels, whether it's in government, whether it's in civic organizations, whether it's in civil society organizations that does social protests and that. Do you think that's the role for the elders going forward on that?
Well, I don't think there's any organization for the elders as such, so-called. So it's not as if people can say, well, we have failed at various levels, now we want to go to the elders. But there is no organization. they select individuals who are well known, who may be still alive. From the elders, I mean, Bishop Tutu is still there, but very few of that on that level are still alive. So people they still run to people who they consider, maybe not as elders, but in their minds. They still, I mean, they even stop me every now and then. When I'm in the mall, people stop and ask.
Why do you think they do that? Why do people stop you in the malls?
Well, generally not to complain. Very seldom do I come across. Generally people like to talk to people they've read of in the newspapers and so. This morning when I was in the restaurant, the young ladies, the waitresses, they've heard of the name.
Right.
Can we have a photograph with you? Now, if I walk with you in the mall, whether it's Kelani Mall or Rosebank Mall or anywhere, invariably you'll find people. Stop, can we have a photograph? The thing is that some of us have become a bit more recognizable.
Right.
You appear on television every now and then. So they stop just to have a photograph. It happens this morning, as I said, in the restaurant too. These young ladies, the waitresses, they've heard the name. So they're excited. That can we have a photograph with you? Because we'll never have this opportunity. And of course, we understand what they want to do, and we always have patience.
Right. But would you the reason why I'm having this interview with you to work on the biography of the servant is precisely because you are considered not only as a servant of the people but also as an elder in South African society, and many others sees you across the world as an elder that they can go to share a problem, to ask for advice and assistance, and just to listen to your opinion about a particular matter.
Well, to the extent that it's practical, I would first say, now, where do you come from? Is there an ANC branch? Is there a civic organization that you can turn to? Where I'm standing, I'm divorced from everything. Person in Naledi, I can't go and give advice. If there's a structure there, I'd say, no, is there a structure there?
Right.
Go to that structure. That's where you start off. Eventually, if they fail all over, then they can come to other people. But my response has always been, when people come for advice, where do you come from? Whether you're ANC or anything, that's not. If there is an ANC, is there an ANC branch? Go to them. If there's not, is there a civic organization? Is there a trade union? Any other civic organization in your area? Work through that.
My last question to you is that if a youngster come to you and say to you that, Dr. Kathrada, I want to go work for government as a public servant, what would be the 3 characteristics that you will identify for him that he or she must have to be able to work for government, to serve the people, or in a foundation or in a non-profit organization? What is the 3 characteristics that you will say that person must have?
Well, I won't be able to judge now the ability of any individual. But I would, without even asking, I would want to know, if a person comes to ask me, I would want to know, what is it you want to do? Do you want to become a doctor? Do you want to become a lawyer? Do you want to become a civil servant? What is it that you want to become? On the basis of that, one has to in certain cases it will be personal. Have you been to school? Have you got certificates? What have you got? Have you been to university? Then one can say, look, I can give you some advice, but I cannot give you definitive advice. In the end, my advice can be limited. I don't know everything about you and your abilities and so forth. But to the limited extent, I know that there are organizations you can turn to. To that extent, I can advise you. If there's a trade union, what factory are you working in? Go to such and such a trade union. Wherever possible, that advice I can give you. But I can't take on a responsibility of a general responsibility of being able to advise people, for whatever advice they come for. The one has to be very careful there.
And human relations?
Human
relations?
Human relations?
Yes.
Well, that's a broad thing.
What type of human relationships would you advise a person to have with his citizens?
Well, I mean, what I would like, and I think people are involved in organizations, whether it's sports, whether it's cultural organizations, it will be so much good if they are involved in these, especially people who can contribute and want to do things. There are avenues that they can use of to make their contributions. There I would advise them. If they are young people, there are also avenues they can. If they are university students, there are organizations they can do this. High school students, there are organizations. Because as individuals, you can't achieve much. As organizations, you can.
Again, the collective.
Yes. You can't just do things as individuals. If you want to make progress, hope to make progress, you can only do it through a collective, as you say.
Ahmed Kathrada, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.